Greetings and salutations, and welcome to another installment of an Old Testament Academic Reacts. If you like this sort of content, please don't hesitate to hit the like button, subscribe, and leave a comment down below. Also, we have a Patreon now, or Patreon, depending on how you pronounce it, and that link will be in the description below as well. Um, Instead of me going through a PowerPoint today and just lecturing everyone, I thought we'd do something a little bit different today, and I thought I'd bring on the future Dr. Erin Newton on to talk about nerdy OT stuff, Old Testament stuff. She currently is pursuing a PhD at Carroll BH Seminary. Might have that backwards. BH Carroll Seminary. In addition to her studies at BH Carroll, she is also a contributing writer at Park Forum, and that link will be in the description below. So, future PhD, Ms. Erin, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. Well, you can't jinx me now. Now I have to finish it because I already have this great introduction. Yeah, I started studying Old Testament really because I'm a nerd, really. That was kind of a childhood dream there. But I have 4 kids. I do PhD stuff somewhere in the middle of the night. I think that's pretty generic. None of us sleep anymore. We just do school and read and write. I serve at the seminary on their prayer ministry. I coordinate that whole ministry for them. And so we do chapels and online prayer time and things like that. And then I'm a contributing writer for the Park Forum, which has been a really fun experience writing things that are not academic. Like I get to use all the things I know, but writing it in a very tangible kind of method that's good for lay people and not necessarily scholars. So I feel like I'm working both parts of my brain on that. But yeah, I live here in Texas for the time being. I think that will, when the PhD happens, when it's done, I'll probably go see the world a little bit.
Yeah, when Supervisor 2 finally does his work.
Yes.
So, we'll get things started here. So, what interested you in your field of study, actually?
I knew I was going to study the Bible really because I was a miserable soul in high school. And I was like, I just want to do something I love. So I decided to go to college, study biblical studies. But as far as like Old Testament, New Testament, getting into that world, it actually was a little bit just haphazardly thrown my way. I stumbled into Hebrew through a youth leader. I'd picked up his textbook, and suddenly I was reading the textbook, and he was like, "You're learning this better than I am." I was like, "Oh, maybe I have a future in this." So I got into Old Testament. I had a phenomenal Old Testament professor, like my first class of like freshman year of college. He was ancient. He was like a dinosaur, but he was so good. And he would tell stories about studying with W.F. Albright. I mean, it was amazing. And
My word.
yeah, so I was like, well, I guess I'm hooked now because I want this future for myself. So that, and along with like, I'm an 80s kid. So I grew up with like Indiana Jones as being like one of my favorite movies. And that whole ancient history and academic side was like, this is it. This is what I want to do. Jurassic Park and fossils, not the science side, but all that. And of course, I think you're going to agree with me. Favorite movie as a kid, like a weirdo, was The 10 Commandments. I loved it. Like, why as a child? But that's what I loved. So I think it all kind of just got meshed together. It's kind of funny. Like, people ask all the time, why Old Testament? I'm like, I don't know. I have no idea. But it came to me, and I have never regretted focusing on Old Testament specifically. So
Gotcha. For me, it was the 10 Commandments. It was the classic 10 Commandments, 1956, and it was only like it was Egypt. So I used to watch the movie up until the actual Exodus in the movie, and then I'd quit watching it because that part was the only thing that I thought there was. Of course, there was like the whole wandering in the wilderness and all this and everything.
Mm.
So that's what first interested me. I was going to go into Egyptology first.
Oh, that's cool.
That was my plan. I learned German, French, just like you have to in this field as well. I was going to start learning Egyptian. I even became a member of RC, which is the Egyptology version of SBL. I'm a member of that too. And I was going to do the whole 9 yards. I picked up a James Hawke textbook in Egyptian, started rummaging through it. And Manley and Conley's book, which teaches you how to read, like it gives some basic grammar and then teaches you how to read tombs and coffin texts and stuff. So started doing that and then was promptly rejected. And then I'm thinking, okay, well, what now? And then I had a professor of mine tell me, well, you could always do biblical studies. I mean, I'm like, okay, well, I already have an interest in ancient Near Eastern history anyway. Let's just go ahead and mesh that together. And got my master's from Liberty, and here we are. And I'm at Southeastern Baptist right now. Actually, yeah, that's where I am now, under Dr. Hardy. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
that's awesome. I feel like we all have like the gateway culture is Egyptian, like that was what was so fascinating, like watching the Ten Commandments. I'm the same way. I'll watch it up until the Red Sea and I'm like, done. I mean, like I really don't need the next part. I mean, I just want the culture, and it's probably not even very well done, historically accurate or anything, but just that world is fascinating to me. I always loved their gods. I loved the polytheism. I loved just that whole kind of mythic background. Man, it's fascinating.
so
We love it.
It was cool, especially with the way they did everything back then. I don't know if they could do a remake of it today, but they'll probably ruin it with it. I don't know. So, who were you studying under then over there?
Oh, this is my sad story.
Aw,
One
wah,
sad
wah.
story today. Sorry. So last year I spent the year studying under Dr. Nancy DeClasse Walford. And she's a Psalms scholar. She's brilliant, and I loved every second. But she was sort of in transition to retire. And I think it was kind of like on the cusp, like, can she take in more PhD students and things like that? And it was like, no, she's decided to go full retirement. She deserves it. I think she's finishing her international SBL presentation. I think she did it last week. But it's like, she's like, this has got to be it. I've got to, continue with my life after being an academic, a very involved academic for decades. So I am in no man's land, and it's horrible. I don't know what I'm going to do, but at BH Carroll, they find your supervisors for you based on your specific research. So they had already found her for me. So I have no doubt that I'll get another supervisor that's equally as wonderful. I've already asked, I would like another woman. That was a fun experience, especially when you're both like feminists. And so that was good. I'm like, I think I need more of this to kind of keep it going. So I have no answer, and it's scary.
Oh, that's fine. To be determined. Yep.
Yeah.
For me, when I was accepted and everything, I flew up to North Carolina in January of this year, and I met Dr. Hardy there in his office, and about 10 minutes into it, he goes, "Well, I'm going to go on a sabbatical for the summer."
Oh no!
And I'm going to go to Cambridge. And I'll be on a sabbatical for the autumn semester too. And I'm going, this is great stuff.
Awesome.
We'll be in touch. And I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
So that's where I am right now. Officially, it's Dr. Hardy, but we'll see where it goes when the semester starts next month. So why don't you? You mentioned, or I mentioned actually, we both mentioned the Park Forum. I didn't know if you could go into more detail of what the Park Forum actually does and what you guys do as. Yeah.
So this is an online, the Park Forum is an online devotional kind of ministry. They create a devotional, and it's quick. It's 400 words, and that is a hard line. We don't go more than 400 words. Devotional Monday through Friday, every chapter of the Bible. So it's a 2-year rotation. And they have a student writing month every June. And that's the first time I heard about it a couple years ago. And I was a graduate student. And I said, this sounds pretty cool. They're like, you can practice writing, get some good coaching and editing kind of feedback. And so I did that. And then I did it the next year. And I was like, oh, this is pretty fun. Like, you get to kind of keep your own rights to your writing as well. So you can say you've been published, at least online, for a little bit of writing. And they asked me to go ahead and come on and do it year round. So now I write every Wednesday, unless our schedules are weird, then we might change it up. So I do the Wednesday ones. It's really fun. I feel like this is where I take all the nerdy stuff I know and try to translate that into something that someone who doesn't have a degree in Bible or multiple degrees in Bible can understand. And so it's fun. You learn like a little bit of a new voice when you're writing for just regular readers. The idea, it was started in New York by a girl named Bethany Jenkins. I think she works for the Veritas Forum now, who does a lot of academic faith, science or intellectual debates usually happen with that. And she realized that there was a need for like quick devotionals. Like, people need to be able to read them on a subway ride. And so that's where the short form came from. And we just have continued that. So it's been really, really fun. I try to always write on Old Testament. We have a Old Testament, New Testament passage each day. And so I usually always take Old Testament just for the pure challenge. Like, we're in Leviticus, a few months ago, and I'm like, okay, let's see if can I write a devotional on Leviticus 12 or something kind of hairy. And so it's been good. I love doing it. It's a fun little income too for me. I'm like, oh, this will pay my PhD. And so it's fun. I don't think that was where I thought I would be. I like writing. I like academic writing a lot.
Yeah.
And so devotional writing is a little bit of a stretch, but it's a good one, like a good skill to have learned.
Yeah. For me, I like academic writing too, even when I write the script for this.
Oh yeah.
Or
I know.
if I'm right, like, it's always academic and it's always Turabian. It's always Turabian. I've had some students in the past ask, can you help me on this? Oh, and it's an MLA format, and I cringe every time. I'm like, no, not at all. But no, I wind up helping them, but it's just so cringe writing writing on a different writing format. That's what I mean.
That's true.
But yeah, other than that, it's academic all the time.
Yeah.
So what was your master's thesis on, actually?
Okay, so
here we go.
The master's thesis. If you have to spend like a year writing something, I got advice, like, let it be something that you love, because by the end you'll hate it. Like, you'll be so sick of that topic, which was good advice. The title, is such a nerdy, like, technical title, but it was a comparative analysis of monotheism, henotheism, and Chaoskampf in the Old Testament. So what I was doing was like looking at Old Testament texts that have this idea or reflection of Chaoskampf, and comparing that. I had to kind of be very specific. Again, you have limited pages. So I picked only Ugaritic myths. So I just wanted to look at those texts compared to Ugaritic myths, looking for similarities there. And then also surveying the archaeological, like, material culture. I did 5 sites. I did Hatzor, Megiddo, Gezer, Lachish, and Rosh Shamra, looking for any kind of findings and images that would reflect the same Chaoskampf imagery from the texts. And this really came from John Day has a book called God's Conflict with the Sea. I think it's like an 1985's book. I think it's a publication of his. It's his dissertation. It's a great book. Everybody has it. Well, if you're in this very niche research area, everybody has the book. But he asks this question, like, towards the end. Like, he's presented his whole his whole thesis. And he says that it's necessary to kind of look to see how living the myths were for the people, and whether it was just poetic imagery or something they really believed. So that's where I started with, like, okay, can we take the material culture and show that they were worshiping, we knew that they worship Baal, we know they worship Asherah, and those, figures, they kind of lump that into a very generic category in the Old Testament. But I wanted to see if the myth about the dragon or the sea serpent, whatever you want to call it, if it was real for them, we should have that type of imagery in the material culture and in the Old Testament text. So that's what I was looking for. It was so fun. I mean, you're looking for dragons everywhere. I'm like, snakes, I mean, I have so many snake, like, little, like, people were giving me snake jewelry, snake earrings, because I was like obsessive about finding serpents in any record. So that was worth spending a year to kind of research and write out. And I did find that there is quite a bit, at least with the text. I feel like that's your easier connection. Like, the Old Testament definitely has references to these myths. It has imagery that it shares with the myths. And then the material culture, that one got really interesting, because as I was looking for serpent images and references to Asherah or any of these female deities, it was getting really closely related to fertility cults and fertility worship, or things in that area, which, the research led me into snake images, and fertility issues are very closely linked, visually and things like that. I'm like, oh, okay, I see why they used a snake for fertility. But so that was kind of the awkward part as I was researching. I'm like, I don't know if I could tell my parents about this research, but here's all these images of snake, kind of phallic images. And so it was fascinating. I think the Old Testament, in the end, the punchline to my thesis is, I think that the Old Testament used the imagery to really show the supremacy of Yahweh by comparing it to the same stories that were told in the other cultures, and like where their deities like Baal and Marduk, where they have flaws and weaknesses, Yahweh never does. So that was the end of it. It was great. I loved it. I highly recommend studying something you love or find interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I've going over that video that I made a couple weeks ago. It was really involved with the Ugaritic Baal cycle as well, or Baal, whatever.
Yeah.
We're talking about the same.
I'm from Texas, so I'm like, it's going to be Baal here, but academically, if I was at SBL, I would definitely say Baal.
Baal. Yeah, right. So for me, my master's thesis, I'm not really sure. I mean, it's going to be Joshua. At least that's kind of what my leaning is towards, since I was really heavy into the Exodus, especially with ancient Egypt and stuff before. But now I think it's going to be in Joshua. I know I got like Joshua 7 in my bio on Twitter, I think, but I'm going to probably focus somewhere around there, Joshua 7. Hopefully it's not set in stone yet, so we'll figure it out when Dr. Hardy comes back from sabbatical, whenever, hopefully soon. Probably shoot him an email though. But for me, so for my master's, I'm not really sure what I narrow it down on, but it's definitely going to be the book of Joshua.
That sounds cool.
You said as far as the Chaoskampf is concerned, or Chaoskampf, whatever, when you don't know whether to anglicize it or just keep it German way.
It's true.
That's probably one of my biggest things, is when I see the German word, I have to pronounce it.
You can do that. Right? I'm going to go with full Southern English. It's just Chaoskampf.
Yeah, Chaoskampf. Yeah. So, where was my question? There it is. Sorry. Are there any other examples of the Chaoskampf within the Old Testament other than the first chapter of Genesis, as my video went over a couple of weeks ago?
Yeah, I think. Oh, yes. So my answer is a full yes. It really, you begin this. I got into Chaoskampf. It's going to be Chaoskampf forever for me. I got into this on accident. I was supposed to be studying Ezekiel and I hated it. But it was like what my graduate supervisor kept pushing, and I didn't love it. And then in a random conversation, these chaos monsters come up, and I was like, "Excuse me, a dragon? That sounds fascinating." So I easily got it. So, but going into it, I really was like, so you have creation, and you might have Job with Leviathan and Behemoth, depending on how you interpret those creatures. And that was it, right? But as you kind of get into this and you kind of see all the different layers to like this myth, the broader category would be like cosmology, any of these kind of beginnings myths. And the Chaoskampf is, more of this, the struggle, any of the stories that have like a really strong struggle. Now, some will say, I know, like Dr. Toshio, David Toshio Samura, he does not prefer reading a lot of Chaoskampf or chaos or any kind of conflict into like the Genesis account and some of the later ones. So there is a group of scholars that would say like, oh, it's all been demythologized. The imagery is still there, but the myth part has kind of been removed. Yeah. So it's kind of interesting to have that kind of pushback from other scholars. But of course, then you have all your, your Herman Gunkels and your Albrights and Frank Moore Cross, all those Olden Goldies guys. They love the seeing conflict in everything. And so it really depends on what you're looking for. Like I was going with serpent images, like serpent references the dragon or something like that, and Behemoth, which is not a dragon, but it's the pair in Job, so we take them both together. But you have that in Isaiah and in Psalms, in Job, of course, multiple times. It's not just Job 41, but Leviathan is mentioned in chapter 7. There's references in chapter 9 and 26. And then if you want to, if you're broadening it out to just the sea, the idea of like dividing the sea, we have Exodus, and we have all the references to that in the poetry of Psalms. And it is pretty prevalent. I think now that I know what I'm looking for, see it everywhere. Now, some people will say that's just wanting to see it everywhere. But I still say, according to my thesis, they were already worshiping these deities. I don't think that they could worship Baal. They can't have their Asherahs if they don't also accept the myths. And I think the myth imagery was used to have like a very specific polemic effect. So I'm going to say it's everywhere, but I am totally okay sitting in a room with someone saying it's not. I actually got on a little bit of a tit for tat sort of fight on Twitter a couple of years ago with a New Testament guy who he wanted to talk about the Jesus calming the sea. He had a question about it, and I threw out, I'm like, well, do you feel like there's any cosmological language going here? Like, God battling the sea and having control over the sea is a very strong Old Testament image. And he was like, absolutely not. And this was a guy with lots of followers, and he's very nice. He's not one of the mean ones, but I was like, oh, okay. So I know that there's enough people that will disagree. It's okay. I mean, they're wrong, but it's okay.
I was gonna say they've got to be wrong, because I see it there too in the same New Testament. We'll read the same New Testament, right? Right. I mean, it was interesting though. You mentioned some of the scholars don't really want to see the cosmological language throughout the Old Testament, especially in Genesis 1, because Dr. Paul Chocho was all about it. He goes, how can you not read Tehom and think Tiamat? It plays into the sea myth.
Yes. Thing. And I know, like, there's that big question, like, etymologically. I think initially they were so certain that this is Tehom, this is Tiamat, they're related. But then later, there's more people coming out that do more of the linguistics, or like, it might not be that close, or as close as we would like it to be. But I feel like as I was going through, I don't know if we're getting off topic, but as I was going through like the archaeological stuff, watching even just the figures, because I was following the fertility ritual, fertility religious aspect to the cult. You could watch how the images of the female goddess was changing over time. And sometimes she would look a little like she would have the Egyptian hairstyle. And the way that they would put either snakes or trees, like palms, trees of life, in her hands. Sometimes they would reflect a Phoenician type influence. And so I feel like it's hard for us to say like, oh, it definitely can't be, because we see it like evolve through time. And I did a northern to southern survey of different artifacts to make sure I got all spaces accounted for. And you see like they kind of have a pretty uniform, like some of the stuff we find in Lachish is almost identical to what they find in Rosh Hashanah, where we found the Ugaritic texts. So I think that there's like a blending that often happened, with their religious beliefs and with these myths and how even the language was used. I'm not ready to write it off yet. I don't care what people say. I'm still with Home is probably a Tiamat reference, or at least a hat tip to that.
The letters fit, like the three letters, the Tav and the Hey and the final meme, but I see it. Chocho sees it.
That's enough.
I don't know how you. I was gonna say that's enough. I don't know how you cannot see it. So yeah. So you mentioned your distaste, if you will, of Ezekiel.
Yeah.
I don't know if I want to ask this question now.
You should ask it.
Okay. So after hinting or beating around the bush with Ezekiel, focusing in on Ezekiel's Temple, I was curious about its relation to the actual sea myth in Genesis 1 as well, particularly chapters 40 through 48. Can you perhaps go over those chapters leading up to the temple as the Chaos or Chaoskampf there?
You're gonna mess yourself up the whole time. So okay, so I started everything just focusing on Ezekiel's Temple. Like that was my original thesis plan. But at the time, okay, so this is like full confession hour, but I was raised in a really, really conservative, fundamental, dispensational church. And so reading that, I had always been taught like very literal, this temple is coming back and they're going to build it. And so when I was studying it initially, I mean, my graduate school kind of changed a lot of how I approach the scriptures and how I view them. And, I feel like I've done a full 80 of like, this temple's probably really symbolic. But I think, so all that to say, I didn't have the mythic background and the research that I have now when I was studying it. So I don't know if I could even like fully describe of how it portrays like the sea myth, but like when I was working on it, one of the things that was hard with my very literal initial ideas about it was, what do we do with this river of life that's coming straight out of the temple? It doesn't make any sense geographically. It's kind of like impossible. It's just a weird scenario of what's happening there. But when you turn it around and you say, okay, well, let's take the mythic language and see what if this is not a literal description of what it's supposed to look like? Which again, if you want to take it that way, that's all power to you. But I do see that you still have this garden image, this like recreation. I think this is how we should read Revelation. Like we have this creation image of like paradise in Genesis. And then we have, Ezekiel saying like, we are going to go full circle and come back to this garden of eternal life. And I think that has like a better reflection of probably the Babylonian, that garden, the tree of life and living eternally and that whole, that whole quest that he's going on. But I think it mirrors that better. I had a whole chapter, the only part of Ezekiel that I had for my thesis and actually got cut because my thesis is like 120 pages. It's like stupid long. And they said 30 more pages was unacceptable. So I cut the last section, which was on Ezekiel 8 and like the vision of the idolatry in the temple and I was trying to play in with the different types of like polytheistic worship that they're going through. He has like this weird, he's like digging through the wall and he's seeing these people. But there's these, there's like some sort of relief on the wall that he sees, and there's like he calls it like creeping things, or that's how it translates out.
Yeah.
But I was going to go in and say like, this is like the serpents. These are, they all fall into that same category, and that that practice of worshiping these elements of that myth still exists in Ezekiel's time. But it was too long, so it got cut. So unfortunately,
Bad Panda
my
Bear.
hatred towards Ezekiel continued all the way to the final chop, and it didn't make it. So I can't.
I love that.
I can't answer all your Ezekiel Temple
You're
questions
good.
at
No
all.
worries. No worries. We can always go back to Exodus.
Yeah.
So for me, I'd never really thought of the sea myth, if you will, to avoid a word, to be in the Exodus until the wonderful Dr. Carmen Imes. I saw her in an interview on YouTube. I think it was a couple of years ago. She wasn't adamant, but it's the wrong word. But she goes, oh yeah, she was very certain. Like, oh yes, you see it in the whole book in Exodus. It's not just chapter here, chapter there. It's not just Ezekiel. Oops, it's not just Exodus 14 and 15. It's the whole book. And I actually took a step back. Well, I wasn't there, but you watch it and then you kind of pause, ponder some more, and I'm like, yeah, I kind of rolled it over in my head for a couple minutes, and I thought, yeah, it's there. I mean, it's an etiology, of course, but it's got all that stuff in there. So like Exodus, or the Exodus, Ezekiel, I'm mixing up my books. It's not good.
They're all the same.
So can you walk? Okay, this might be a bit easier then. Can you walk us through the book of Exodus and the sea myth?
Yeah. Well, as best as I can. I spend all my time in wisdom literature. Now my new master is just wisdom lit all time. But I didn't also see this like cosmological background growing up with Exodus, and even not until much later. It's one of those, once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. So Exodus will always be like, oh yeah, we are playing out this same idea of conflict with the sea, conflict between deities and things like that, and like vying for the hearts of the people. Which it's always funny. I always feel like with the Babylonians, they were like anti-human, sometimes in their myth of they're too loud and obnoxious and kill them off. But I think I probably would never be able to explain it to the level of Dr. Imes. I know like that is her bread and butter. Like
I was like,
that's
no.
thing. Yeah, she's so good. But I think when I first began school and going through like even like beginning with this idea of like the plagues and how they were focused on some of the deities of the Egyptian religion, and how it's like this. It's interesting because like the plagues are focusing on like this natural order, which in many ways, this militaristic kind of like God, Yahweh as a warrior, he's always using nature rather than like weapons. And so you see these animals being specifically targeted, or like using frogs and gnats, and the blood, the blood in the Nile, and their beliefs about the water of the Nile and how that's part of life-giving things. Like it is playing into different things of the sea myth, like the division of the waters in myths outside of the Old Testament. That's usually a creative kind of act, like they're making either salt water, fresh water, or land out of the body of the slain deity, things like that. And just like water is kind of this primeval source, this is like where all life comes out of, this water. And suddenly you have this plague of turning the water into blood and making it unclean, and you can't even consume it. They can't get into it and like cleanse themselves and do their rituals. So you have these stories going through, like even attacking the livestock, and giving them boils and like killing those off. Like it is attacking different elements, especially with Egyptian deities that are often, reflected in kind of animal, like morphs. They've got like the crocodile head, and then you've got your dogs and all the other ones. And so with the sea myth, it's not like a perfect parallel. And I think that's what gets most people mixed up with comparing the cosmological myths with the Old Testament references. Like it's not going to line up one for one every single time in the same order, but you just keep seeing the same messages being told in the Old Testament with this little bit of a tweak that it's going to be Yahweh that is victorious over whatever the conflict is. I love the Song of the Sea, chapter 15, and when they are defeating or like, after they have crossed the Red Sea, the sea has been split, which again, splitting of the sea is like your common mythic imagery. Ugaritic has kind of a splitting of Yam. You have Tiamat and Marduk. And, it's always like there is life out, after the splitting, and they come and their God is victorious. And the language of the Song of the Sea is really archaic, whether that was purposeful or the song itself is actually archaic and they're borrowing it from kind of a common myth. That's my preferred theory. But again, I would let somebody tell me I'm wrong. But I might not believe them. But you have this like constant story of Yahweh using the storm. This is a very Baal type of image, the rider of the clouds. Yahweh is using the storm to split the sea, to conquer the Egyptians. In that song, it kind of references multiple ways that Yahweh defeats the people, and it's all natural elements, which again is a common image, even though with Baal, he does use some weapons. He uses his monsters, which Yahweh doesn't have to, because those monsters are his pets. That we read later. Like they're not meant for fighting. They're not really. God doesn't need a sidekick of any sort. And then I think it's cool. Like with Exodus, you go through that conflict, and then you go to the mountain. That's like your next, location, and that is exactly the end goal for all of the myths, to get a house on top of the mountain. And it's obviously for the deity who's most victorious. And so you have the people meeting God, or Moses meeting God at the top of this mountain. And those are like the little elements. I'm like, oh, I've never thought about all the deities of ancient religions. Not all, most have a mountain. We've got Olympus, and we've got pyramids, like all kinds of like mountainous type references there. And when they create the temple and the tabernacle, like it's just the temple is built like a garden. Like we go back to these garden images. We have the basin, I think, in the temple. So it's not the tabernacle, but in the temple, they have like their basin that they called the sea. And it's the sea that sits motionless all the time in the presence of God. And so that's the little imagery that just kind of gives me goosebumps sometimes, because when we read the Ugaritic myths and the sea is turbulent and it's fighting with the deity, and you don't know who's really going to win. And then we turn to the Old Testament and it's like, oh, the sea's right there and it's very quiet and it doesn't ruffle or anything. And then we get to Jesus, and that's the part that they told me I was crazy, but I'm like, I think I'm right.
I would agree. I think you're right.
Yeah. So I wish I knew the Exodus like connections well enough to be like, oh, we can walk through it. But the images are all there. And it's such a beautiful kind of like reflection on the Israelites' theology, using the same images, the same language. I think that's what made the people accept it, because it wasn't so bizarre and new. Like they had a kind of a baseline understanding of that idea.
Yeah, definitely. I would actually agree with that as well. They already knew about it. They knew about
Mhm.
the surrounding myths, the surrounding culture, and everything. So it just seemed to fit to appropriate the surrounding the gods, and then say no, Yahweh, like for example, like you said, the Leviathan or a behemoth, they're just God's pets, they're Yahweh's pets, whereas they're actual creatures of chaos in Ugarit or Babylon. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So touching on that, how much of an influence would you say the Baal cycle had on the Old Testament?
I feel like a lot. No.
That's an
I feel like
understatement.
it depends. Yeah. If you were just ask me like which one is more influential, like which myth, I laugh because I feel like it's going to be whichever text we found most recently. Scholars will be like, oh no, it's Ugaritic, because prior to 1920s when those were all discovered, everybody, and by like Hermann Gunkel, like the pioneers of this whole concept, we're all saying that it's the Babylonian myth. There's some great parallels. We definitely need to know the Babylonian myths in order to understand the Old Testament, and like why are we talking about God riding on a cloud, and some of the storm imageries and things like that. But I think that it's the location of Ugarit and where it was with Israel. Now they are kind of declining as Israel's coming into the promised land. So there's kind of the disadvantage of like how prominent were they when Israel was coming in? Did they trade that much? How much influence would they have had on one another? But I think that it makes more sense to say that the Baal myth probably is more influential than maybe the Enuma Elish.
Mhm.
But I think there's just an amalgamation all the time. They are
Yeah.
all they're not keeping their religious beliefs in kind of a bubble. That they are definitely mixing as they trade, as they intermarry, as they work with each
Mhm.
other, as they conquer one another, and there's some assimilation and syncretism that's happening. Um, I I think some of the language that, especially what I studied, Litanu as or Lotan, I think depends on whose pronunciation you're gonna choose, but Litanu
Chaoskampf.
as the Ugaritic sea serpent.
Mhm.
There's language and there's references to that in Isaiah that are nearly verbatim to what you find on the tablets for the Baal myth. And I think from that kind of quoting, I'm going to say that Ugaritic is more influential. And you can, apart from the fact that it doesn't have like a creation story, I'm saying we just haven't found it yet, but
Yeah.
we have yet to find a Ugaritic like creation of like the universe and how humans came to be, that kind of story yet.
Mhm.
That's the only place that I think that we need some of the other myths from like Babylon and other places to kind of fill in the gaps. But I'm gonna go with Ugaritic for just for the sake of I
Who knows? I
spent
mean,
my life. No, I spent a year devoted to it, but for now,
yeah.
I think that is the most influential. And anytime we talk about the sea, that would be my first place to start, and then go backwards to some of the other cultures. Yeah.
Yeah, I would actually agree and say it's the Baal myth. I just see it. Yeah, and there's no theomachy, of course, in
Hmm.
the Old Testament, but I think I mentioned this in the video, was that you're not going to find the sea myth verbatim in each culture. Like, for example, in Ugarit, it's going to be different from the Enuma
Hmm.
Elish and then the creation account in Genesis 1 and 2. So I think it's, like you said, a conglomeration that seems to make the most sense. Now, switching gears here, since you said your future thesis will be something to do with the book of Job,
Yeah.
if I'm right. Okay, good. I did hear that correctly.
Yeah.
Yay!
Yay.
Um, I am a good listener. Um, so obviously there would probably be some sea myth references in the book of Job as well. Could you point out where those would be in the book?
Yeah. So again, I started with just thinking it would be the last chapters, and I was so wrong. I spent the spring semester only reading for Nancy, Dr. Nancy, creation theology in wisdom literature. That was just textbook after textbook. And that's where it really started to open up like this broader kind of like catalog of things to be looking for when we're talking about this mythic language. And so other than like specific references to Leviathan, I mean, you see him earlier in chapter 3 and I think 7, 9, and 26, like some things I might have remembered those correctly, but I probably will lean a little bit away from specifically Leviathan and look more at this idea of it's like more creation language, like talking about the day and the night and just the foundations of the earth kind of being created. There's Job has this unfortunate, prologue of miserable scenarios. And the first thing he really starts to talk about in, I think it's chapter 3, when we start into it, he basically is asking for the reversal of creation. He's like, I wish there was, curse the day I was born. I wish, day was night and light was dark. And, he wants to kind of uncreate. And then God at the end is answering his miserableness with like, hey, let's rehash creation. And then this big long, 4-chapter story of his control over creation. And then you have your monsters at the end. And so I think I don't have to focus on Leviathan so much and can kind of look at this idea of creation. What I got into as a tangent for another professor, I had to write a paper for a research class. And so I got into looking at woman wisdom, again, drawing on this idea of these myths include this female goddess. Is she the consort of Yahweh? Is that what they kind of initially understood her to be? Because what we say their theology is, their monotheism on paper looks so good. In practice, their practice of it, horrid. Like they struggled just like we struggle. So it's totally cool. And so looking at this Asher, like if they believe they had a consort, what is her place in some of these myths? This, you always have, a goddess involved in these myths in some way. With woman wisdom, a lot of people will trace her back to Asherah or Atharatu, whoever you want to pin her down as, because she's kind of, again, a conglomeration of multiple goddesses of the ancient Near East. She changes figures into this more abstract wisdom. It's more like, oh, you must go find her, like in Proverbs, like she's the greatest thing to have, which is, interesting because they had been worshiping a goddess. And so that's problematic. And so I think I'm going to try to see how she fits into like wisdom in Job. We have Job 28 kind of in the middle. Where's wisdom to be found? You're trying to mine for her. If you go to the depths of the earth, you can't find her. If you go up to the heavens, you can't find her. Anyways, it's a weird, her place is kind of like enigmatic, but all the other myths elements are there. Like I can find all the other pieces to that myth in Job. She's kind of weird. And I think that's probably where my feminist kind of reading will probably come into this. Like, what can we get? Like, where's the female voice behind all of this? And you get a lot of like, it's hard not to do the cosmological stuff without getting into fertility or birth related things, the waters of the womb. And it's all so closely connected. And I think in our world, we don't put those things together. Like birthing is birthing and religion is religion and the two shall not mix. We think it's weird, but for them, it was always like religion and spirituality was involved in every aspect of their life. So I think it's there. I just haven't pinpointed it down. I'm just moving further away from the last 2 chapters and probably closer up to the initial ones where Job is really wanting to curse the day he was born. It works well because I feel like I'm always like, if I'm not, I'm acting happy now because I love this topic, but
Yeah.
always a little bit of sadness just stays with me wherever I go, a little, emo moments of life. And so Job just was like, oh yeah, I can feel it. I feel what he feels. I know what he's going through. So
Yeah.
I could devote my life to this miserable soul.
As far as the Old Testament's concerned, I can definitely relate to Job.
Yes.
On the daily,
Yeah.
it's just, and it's even like just constant struggle. Like, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? Wish I weren't here. All
Yeah.
this other stuff, or
Yeah.
it could be first world problems, or
That's
anything
true.
really. It could be work, anything. So
Yeah, I think it was
yeah,
like asking the question, how does Chaoskampf answer somebody's questions about the hardest day of their life? That
yeah.
was what kept driving me. I'm like, how can this be an
Mm.
answer? How can God say, well, did you see my dragon? Be like, what
Not
kind of
bad.
answer is that? So yeah, so I'm just gonna keep looking for that answer. Like, how is misery answered with conversations about cosmology and using this mythic language? And I don't know. I have no answer to my own future
It's
research, but
something
oh
I'd
well.
never really thought of. Like, really? Okay.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, I would like to thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thank you.
Um, yeah, that's about it. That's all I have anyway. So, yeah, I'd like to thank you for coming on, and that's about
Yeah, no, it was such a
it.
joy to be here. I'm so glad that you asked me to come on. Um,
Yeah.
every scholar loves to talk about their research, but nobody wants to talk about this myth. And you have to have a little bit of a background to
Yeah.
really get into the conversation. So it's been a joy. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Well, guys, thank you for watching, and as always, please like, subscribe, and comment.